From Columbia, in high definition, this is WIS News 10 Awareness.
Does race matter when it comes to getting into college? Is affirmative action necessary anymore? We tackled the U.S. Supreme Court's recent decision involving the state of Michigan. And the very reason affirmative action was created in the first place, expanding equality in education, looking back 60 years at the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Good morning and thank you for joining us for Awareness. I'm your host, Megan Norman. A U.S. Supreme Court decision upheld a ban in the state of Michigan on affirmative action in higher education. In 2006, voters in Michigan passed a referendum to ban race from being considered in the admissions process for public colleges and universities. Last month, a 6-2 decision said that ban is legal. I spoke with the USC law professor Derek Black about this decision and its implications nationwide. Thank you for joining us this morning to talk about affirmative action. Let's start with what was the purpose? What was it designed for?
Well, affirmative action really has a couple of different lives. Its original life was a direct remedy to intentional discrimination coming out of the civil rights movement. So during the late 70s and early 80s, there was the idea that we really need to reverse a lot of the historical discrimination that's occurred in this country. More recently, we've moved towards sort of the idea that diverse environments are good for schools, they're good for the workplace, they're good for neighborhoods. And so what we're really talking about in many of what we might call affirmative action programs today are not remedies for past discrimination, but how do we build a better school? How do we build a better community?
Let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court decision that involved the state of Michigan. What did that decision say? Well,
it's an extremely complicated decision, so I'll say it as simply as I can, which is simply that if the voters of Michigan want to ban the consideration of race in admissions, they're free to do so. There was a decision in about 2002 called Grutter versus Bollinger, in which the court said that universities have a compelling interest in forming a diverse student body. And once they said that, universities felt free in moving forward and considering race and trying to build a more diverse campus. There was backlash against that, particularly in Michigan, since that was the epicenter of the debate to begin with. And Ward Connerly came from California to help pass a ballot initiative to ban the consideration of race. The Supreme Court says you can consider it, and the voters are saying, well, we want to ban that consideration. And so they did that shortly after the Supreme Court had said, yes, you can operate affirmative action. And this most recent decision says, well, if you don't want it anymore, you don't have to have it.
Right. So do you think diversity will suffer now at the public institutions?
Well, it's certainly going to take a bit of a hit. When we've seen these type of decisions issued, for instance, there was a case called Hopwood versus Texas in the 1990s that dealt with the University of Texas, and as soon as they banned race there, diversity immediately went down in the state of Texas. Texas's response to that was the top 10% plan, whereby the top 10% of each graduating high school class would be automatically admitted to the University of Texas. So what we will probably see is a short-term hit to diversity. The question is, will Michigan and the university come up with another system that sort of works around the new rules, so to speak?
Now, with affirmative action in place, some people argue that that is discrimination, but exactly how did it work? I mean, obviously race was a factor, but how did they use that in their admissions process?
Yeah, I mean, those who oppose the consideration of race say that considering race is discriminating. I think from the university's position, they're considering race to counteract the effects of discrimination. So to put it simply, all test scores are not equal. There is racial bias in the SAT. There is racial bias in the educational opportunities that you receive in K through 12 education. There is socioeconomic bias as well. So that children of higher income or middle income family, or have two parents with PhDs, if their child scores in the 90th percentile on the SAT, when we look at a low-income student who speaks Spanish at home and they score in the 80th percentile, that student may have a lower score, but that ELL student of a low-income background, I would tell you today as an educator, has more capacity, more potential than that student who has a higher score, but their score is higher simply because they come from a family with better equipped to give them things to help them do well on the test. So a lot of these tests, we think of them as though they're objective, but they're really reflecting inequalities in society. And considering race, considering language status, considering poverty, those things counteract that.
If not race, what other standards or factors should be considered in the admissions process?
Well, poverty is one of the big ones. Ultimately, I mean, that's part of the debate, and I think, for right or wrong, President Obama sort of helped set this off by saying, well, I'm not sure Sasha and Malia ought to have race considered because they've got all the advantages in the world. Well, they do have all the advantages in the world, but they're still minorities, and I'm sure they experience things that I didn't experience in my lifetime and my friends didn't experience. So, you know, but when the president says something like that, all of a sudden there's this idea, well, maybe we ought to be a little bit more nuanced.
Really resonates.
Yeah, and I do think we should be nuanced. I mean, I do think that rural children in South Carolina, regardless of their race, are disadvantaged, right? And we ought to consider that. And if we're really going to be fair, if we're really going to think about merit, not how rich your family is, if we're going to think about merit, then we have to consider those other factors as well.
Right, and perhaps really the process should start well before the child is considering college and trying to maybe equal the playing field earlier on.
Yeah, well, you know, 20 years ago when I was in, almost 20 years ago when I was in school, you know, I said, look, affirmative action, that's a really sort of sorry excuse to remedy all of our other problems in society because our schools are so racially unequal, socioeconomically unequal. The truth is we don't have the stomach to fix K through 12 education, so what we try to do is put Band-Aids on it in K through 12. That's not to say we shouldn't put the Band-Aid on in K through 12, but the injury, as you say, really occurs long before then.
Do you think other states could possibly start to implement a ban? We know 7 states currently now have this in place. Do you think it could spread?
Well, I think that the impetus to ban the consideration of race really was on the upswing in 2002, 2003 when the court said, if you want to consider race, you can. I don't know that there's a huge political push now that the Supreme Court has said, you guys can do it. They already thought they could do it. They already passed those bans. I mean, there may be 1 or 2 more states that might ban it, but I don't see there being a lot of push there. I think it's really the civil rights community that's more upset by this decision that wants to push for ways to work around or sort of counteract the negative effects of this decision in places like Michigan.
What is the major takeaway or the lesson that we should be learning from this?
Well, I think we shouldn't worry so much about the Supreme Court. I think what we really ought to think about are, what does it mean to be qualified to go to school? What does it mean to be meritorious? And the one interesting thing that happened in Texas is when they said, you can't use race anymore. And Texas said, well, what is merit in the state of Texas? And they said, well, we think being disadvantaged in lots of other ways other than race is part of merit. And we think that what they adopt is what they call a personal achievement index. So they didn't just look at what your GPA was. They didn't just look at your SAT. They said, where did you come from in life? Right? What happened before you got this score? And so that we want to contextualize that score. After they instituted the Personal Achievement Index in Texas, and the Supreme Court blessed the consideration of race in 2002 in Grutter, they then began considering race again. But I think Texas only got to that place where they could think about merit in a broader way that looked at many factors to take race out of the conversation, because race is such a charged issue that they couldn't think about merit as long as race was part of that conversation. But once they talked about merit for about 5 or 6 years, they were okay with bringing race back into the picture again. So, you know, I don't know whether the voters in Michigan, oddly enough, are quite as progressive as the regents in Texas, but we'll see. You know, we do learn things through adversity.
Right. Well, Professor Black, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Well, thank you for having me.
Still to come on awareness. 60 years ago, the nation took a giant step forward by forcing the integration of public schools. What it was like then and where we are now. We have 2 former students who were integral to the state's integration. Stay with us. May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled segregation in public schools violates the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. That was 60 years ago in the landmark case known as Brown versus the Board of Education. But the separate but equal mentality and atmosphere continued in classrooms across the country and, of course, right here in South Carolina. It was a difficult transition for those pioneers who bravely took some of the first steps into previously all-white schools. 2 of those courageous and resolute women join me now. Lauren Perry Palmer, who helped to integrate Millwood Elementary School in Sumter County, and Ovita Glover, who helped integrate James Simmons Elementary School in Charleston County. Thank you both for joining me this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, we know that, of course, integration does not breed equality. What were some of the challenges you women faced taking those steps into those schools?
Well, as the first in the state of South Carolina to integrate the public schools It happened in Charleston. And it was bittersweet, as it is still, as I remember some of the things, you know. And it's very true about what you hear about history and how the whites would treat the blacks or verbally insult and that kind of stuff. So, and with that being said, it was a little devastating because we were being trained and told not to react to those kind of things and to be dignified, you know, and try to hold your peace. And they used to always tell me to hold my tongue. But during that time, it was difficult, really, to walk through.
I can imagine. And when you integrated James Simmons, that was the second attempt.
That was the second attempt,
Tell us
yes.
about the first time.
The first attempt was in 1960, and that's when the original lawsuit was set. Minerva Brown from Charleston, the daughter of Joe Brown, who at that time was the president of NAACP, Charleston, South Carolina. And I tried to integrate the schools in Charleston September of 1960. However, in my case, it failed because during that time we had to be transferred. When the transfer had to come through the principals from one another. A note came from one principal and went to the other principal saying, Ovita Glover is now da-da-da-da.
Right.
And he forgot to put the school that I would be attending.
And this school was right across the street.
Right across the street.
And you were denied access.
Denied.
Now, Ms. Palmer, you had a similar story, I mean, very difficult and even traumatic, as you told me. Tell me about your time.
I'd like to begin by looking at it in a larger context. I think that we were actually the sacrificial lambs. I like to use that terminology because when you think about the continuum of civil rights in this country, you think about those that were lynched, you think about those that were assassinated, and then you think about those of us who were on the front lines, who had we not gone, there would not be chocolate and ebony faces in our schools. And for me, it was a very, as I look back on it now, it was a very spiritual experience. We were actually, when you think about the children of the civil rights movement, we were the bullets. When you think about warfare, and we were in a war, we were the bullets that were fought, that were exchanged in the battle.
Do you have any regrets about your experience being those bullets?
I think that I have to admit, in all honesty, that I did not want to do it. I was feeling very safe, very loved, very nurtured in my segregated environment. And I did not understand at my young age why I had to do what I had to do. And it was so forced because our parents were civil rights activists, and we were told that we had to do it so that others could come if they weren't willing to send their own children.
Right.
And some of us came from families where they were behind the scenes, they were in positions where they were self-sufficient, and so they were in a position where they could make these sacrifices where others could not. And that was explained to us in this process. But I remember vividly fighting that process. I locked myself in my parents' bedroom. My uncle E. Perry Palmer had to get the firemen to, put a ladder up. And literally, I boarded the door with books from my parents' bookshelf. I mean, I really bombarded. I was so resistant, and I had to be coached every day on what we were doing, why it was important.
Well, and let's talk about that resolve, because your parents, those are the people who gave you that resolve to go back day after day.
Yes.
Right? Ms.
Right,
Glover?
right, exactly. Whatever, my father would always help me put it in the hands of the Lord.
Yes.
Remember that. And that phrase took me to this day right now, 60 years later, Thank you very much. But to say fear, the only fear that I had when I was left alone, without my father and my mother being around, but in the involvement of getting prepared, going to the NAACP meetings, sitting around and hearing the parents involved talk about how they were going to do it, you know, who was going to go first and that kind of thing, really intrigued me at first. And that was the 60th, because I was so excited about being able to walk through that park yard that I always wanted to play in and could not ever go play in.
Right, a park you were denied access to.
Yes. But when the years passed and we did go through the integration of James Simmons. It was 3 of us. We were separated. I was in one class, Gail another, Barbara in the other. Barbara was older. Gail and I was the same age. But we didn't see each other at recess, so we had no way of making contact with each other during the day, the school term.
Did you eventually adjust to your environment, ever?
No, I don't think you ever adjusted. I had the same experience. It's amazing that there were supposedly 3 of us as well at Millwood, but we never saw each other. Not even in the halls did I remember seeing another person of color. And I know that to this day I wear glasses because I was placed in the back of a classroom and refused to be moved to the front. When we would go to the playground, everyone would just scatter as if we had a plague or leprosy. I'll never forget, I had a teacher who was from Pennsylvania who had red hair, and her name was Mrs. Schuler. And she was my playmate, my only playmate. She was Roman Catholic, and she, I think, had a Quaker background in her early experience. And as a result, she was my playmate.
The only playmate
the
you had
only
during
playmate.
that time, as a 5th grader.
That's correct. And our parents were never late for picking us up from school. They were there, could not be late. So there were...
And we were there early.
Oh, yes, we were. And then there were the memories of being carried on the marches. My mother was arrested pregnant with my sister. And remembering all of the meetings, as you mentioned, in the basement of churches, and all of that's vivid. And then wanting to go in and have some water and being told, oh, you don't want that nasty water. So that I wouldn't know that I was not going to have access to the water fountain.
Well, ladies, thank you so much for your sacrifice and being those pioneers that we needed to get to where we are today. We still have so much more to go, so much farther on our journey, but really thank you for the sacrifice. It's a story that we need to continue to tell our current generations and future generations, because they need to see this living history. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
When awareness returns, we turn to an international crisis. More than 200 schoolgirls kidnapped in Nigeria. The outcry to find these children. Welcome back to Awareness. The search for more than 200 girls abducted from their school in Nigeria continues. They were kidnapped last month by a militant terrorist group. Reporter Mary Muller has the story.
Yes, we are drivers. We ran in the bush.
This young woman wanted to remain off camera. She escaped after armed militants stormed her school in northeastern Nigeria. She says she still lives in fear. But she is not alone.
Bring our girls back.
An outpouring of support to bring over 200 girls home has spread from city to city in the U.S. and abroad.
And I want you to know that Barack has directed our government to do everything possible to support the Nigerian government's efforts to find these girls.
Even Pope Francis took to Twitter asking for prayers for their immediate return. So far, the U.S. has sent military and law enforcement personnel to assist in the search.
It looks as if there's a hostage negotiator and then some military advisors.
One challenge the U.S. faces: it can only help at the request of the Nigerian government. And recently, Nigeria came under fierce scrutiny for not doing enough.
And for those kids, for nobody to care, the parents, some of the parents were here yesterday, and one of them said that they had nothing. All they have is the hope in their children.
The government failed us. Government failed us.
The Amnesty International report released Friday alleges Nigerian authorities knew about the attack at least 4 hours before it happened. But they did nothing because they say they couldn't raise enough troops to respond. I'm Mary Muller reporting.
We'll be right back with a final thought. Equality in education is the cornerstone for a better nation and a better world. So many have come before, beginning that civil rights battle. Integration was just one piece. We need to continue fighting for equality and justice in all arenas of life, whether it's college admissions, on the job, or even on the basketball court. When we can get to a place of unity, we as a people can really thrive. Part of achieving that goal is working together, supporting each other, and helping each of us to grow. We would like to thank all of our guests this morning, Professor Derek Black, Lauren Perry Palmer, and Ovita Glover. Until next time, I'm Megan Norman. This is Awareness.